Now, not a single day goes by that I don't think about cancer. And I've dedicated part of my career to it now in the sense that, my blog I dedicated to writing to empower cancer patients just based upon my experience. The 5G itself has been quite controversial, to say the least. If you've got 5G being beamed down on you, you don't really have too many other options. I don't want to come off sounding like I'm a complete technophobe either. I interact with technology daily. I have to for work and what I do. I just think we need to, use the precautionary principle that we could, because we don't have really a mature consensus on what this is doing to us, to minimizing risk. There is so much going on environmentally that we will all try to do our best. And that's one of the reasons, again, why I wrote this book. It's just one piece of the puzzle.
From the Weston A. Price Foundation, welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
Hey everybody, I'm your host Hilda Labrada Gore. This is episode 207 and our guest today is Brandon LaGreca. He has returned for part 2 of a 2-part series on the connections between EMFs and cancer. As you may recall from last week's episode, Brandon is a licensed acupuncturist, a nationally certified Oriental medicine practitioner, and the author of Cancer and EMF Radiation, How to Protect Yourself from the Silent Carcinogen of Electropollution. In part 1, just last week, Brandon discussed the root causes of cancer, some of which, according to recent research, are deeply related to electromagnetic fields, or EMFs. Today, Brandon continues the conversation by telling us more about his own cancer diagnosis and his approach to healing. He also does a deep dive into the science of EMFs, how they can damage our DNA, the difference between 4G and 5G technology, and its effects on our levels of exposure. And he also gives us concrete ideas about how to measure how much radiation exactly we are exposed to in the first place. He's really not trying to alarm us, but rather to alert us to make changes for improved health for ourselves and our families. Before we get into the conversation, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Ancestral Supplements. Grass-fed kidney by Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. New Zealand-sourced nose-to-tail organ meats and bone marrow in convenient gelatin capsules. Our family can't get enough of these supplements. We love them. Order yours today at ancestralsupplements.com. And this marks the 20th anniversary of the Weston A. Price Foundation. This month, help us celebrate 20 years of accurate information on diet and health by supporting local farms. Take the 50-50 pledge. Spend at least 50% of your food dollar buying directly from local farmers and artisans. With the other 50% of your food dollar, you can celebrate how small the world has become and enjoy products from other parts of the world. If you decide to join us in this venture, tag us at Weston A. Price on your social media posts this month, or use the hashtag 5050pledge. And thanks in advance for joining us. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Brandon.
Hello again, Hilda. It's great to talk with you yet again.
Well, we had to have you back because there was so much we didn't get to, and I felt like we left people hanging with your own personal cancer diagnosis. Do you mind telling us what's your situation now?
No, that's totally fine. Yeah, I'm doing quite well. A brief recap, I was diagnosed with lymphoma in 2015. And it was pretty major. It was a stage 4 diagnosis, and it was severe enough that it got me to the ER with some pretty bad issues. And so, I did some treatment then in 2015, and I did the most minimal of treatment. I am, kind of off on one side of the spectrum here. I'll just start by saying that I didn't do chemotherapy or radiation. I chose, and this is with my doctor's agreement too, that I would do a kind of a whole integrative protocol. And a part of that was I did use one drug therapy that's in the category of cancer therapy called immunotherapy, which is an immune-related therapy. And between that and a lot of the other things I did in terms of herbal therapy and detoxification, for me at least, it worked beautifully. And I was in remission later that year. It took about 8 months or so. And so I'm very grateful that was the case. I don't want to sound very cavalier, though, like this is the way to do it and everyone should do it. I just will say that for me, it worked very well. And I'm happy that I did do it that way because as a clinician, I feel like I would have regretted at least not trying. I can always have done, and still to this day can do, heavier drug therapies if called for. But thank you for asking. I'm doing quite well and happy to be doing so many years out now.
Oh, well, we are so happy to hear this, seriously. And we did have an episode or two on cancer recently where people can explore the options and think about how they can take their health back into their own hands and make some of these decisions with all the information at hand, right?
It's a major issue. I mean, to be sure. I mean, now not a single day goes by that I don't think about cancer, and I've dedicated part of my career to it now in the sense that my blog I dedicated to writing for cancer patients to empower cancer patients just based upon my experience. My next book is going to be on it as well. I'm going to try to write a series all along these lines. It's really important stuff, and it affects everybody, Hilda. I don't care if you're a vegan or on a Weston A. Price diet. I mean, it's one of these things that there is so much going on environmentally that we will all try to do our best, but there's just so much we have to encounter with, and that's one of the reasons again why I wrote this book. It's just one piece of the puzzle, one piece. But if you can at least hedge for this one piece, and for those that heard the first part of this podcast, I don't want to come off sounding like I'm a complete technophobe either. I mean, I interact with technology daily. I have to for work and what I do. I just think we need to have use the precautionary principle that we could, because we don't have really a mature consensus on what this is doing to us, that to take some of these precautionary approaches, minimizing risk. I think that's my main message to folks.
Well, that's excellent. And today I want to just back up a little bit and take a deep dive into some of the evidence that points to the risk we are facing with our EMF exposure. Can you talk to us about the corroborating lines of evidence?
Absolutely. So the last time we spoke, we just did this really skim of the research and specifically talked about the SAR ratings of cell phones and what that means and why SAR ratings aren't really that predictive of how safe cell phones are. But now let's take the larger view here and look at all the evidence categorically that collectively suggests that non-native electromagnetic fields are a significant human carcinogen. And so I've identified 4 corroborating lines of evidence. The first is epidemiological studies. Now, what epidemiology is you take a group of people and you look retrospectively to see if they've used, for instance, a cell phone for X amount of years. What is the likelihood that they will have developed a particular type of cancer? And here's what the evidence shows. The evidence is very clear that if it's an epidemiological study that's older than 10 years, 12 years, so they've been following someone for that length of time, and if they were a heavy cell phone user, there is, in these studies, an increased risk of glioma, which is brain cancer, acoustic neuroma, and salivary gland tumors. And here's the rub. If you go and look at just studies that are shorter in their time frame, less than 10 years, you're really not going to see that effect. So it's very similar to what we talked about before about cigarette smoking. Sure, you can smoke one cigarette or even a pack of cigarettes a day for 10 years. Doesn't mean necessarily you're going to have lung cancer. But then now if we go up to 20 years, we got to 30 years, suddenly you start to see that effect accumulate.
Wow, this is very eye-opening because a neighbor friend of mine, she got diagnosed with tongue cancer, and she's like, this is so weird. I don't smoke. Like, where did this come from?
Sure.
Who knows? It might have been related to cell phone use. Is that right?
Well, I think that's possible. And certainly what we're seeing in these epidemiological studies is that these cancers are developing ipsilaterally, which is just a fancy way of saying they're developing on the same side of the head where the cell phone is being held. Now, epidemiological studies in and of themselves are not the most convincing or compelling forms of evidence. What's an even better form is what's called prospective, which means we try to predict ahead of time the kinds of diseases we're going to see from the kinds of inputs. But having said that, we have to kind of use other lines of evidence to support this big picture that we're trying to create. So epidemiological studies is one, but now we turn to a different line of evidence. And for that, we look to just experimental studies. if we are going to say that this form of radiation causes this kind of damage to the body, do we see that experimentally? The answer to that is yes. We talked about it briefly during the first episode, which is the work that's been done by Dr. Henry Lai and Dr. George Carlo that very predictably and reliably show chromosome damage from exposure to certain kinds of radiation. And they did that through the measuring of micronuclei in the cell. So now we have a second line of evidence. Not only do we see that in terms of epidemiology, now we can see that in experiments. So something's going on, but there's more. Now we look to a third line of evidence, which is, okay, if we see this effect in the studies with humans, and if we can figure out that it's happening through certain test tube experiments, what would the mechanism be behind that DNA damage? And for this, there are several proposed mechanisms as to how electromagnetic fields cause DNA damage, and I think all of them probably are at play. The first one, again, that we spoke briefly about last time is the suppression of melatonin. And very clearly, electromagnetic fields suppress melatonin in the body whenever we are exposed to them. So there we have at least one instance where being exposed to these EMF fields predisposes us to malignancy.
This is really fascinating to me, Brandon, because I've been connecting with people in the quantum health space, and they've been talking a lot about melatonin. And some people say that if we supplement with melatonin, as you suggested in our earlier episode, that actually decreases your body's melatonin production, because it's one of those kind of ironic consequences of supplementing sometimes, that our body thinks, oh, there's enough, we better not make any more. And that actually hurts you. What do you have to say about that?
Sure. I get that question a lot. No evidence. I don't think I've ever come across any evidence and I've looked for it, that shows that there is a down-regulating of our body's own hormone with the addition of melatonin into the system. Does not seem to be an issue at all.
Interesting. And yet, I would still recommend, of course, you're the expert here, but I'm just throwing this out there, that people look for ways to boost their melatonin production naturally instead of supplementing, if possible, like I was saying before, by blocking the blue light and maybe making sure to not use too much blue light or have exposure to a lot of bright lights or screens at night, so that their melatonin kicks in earlier.
So there's a couple hacks for that. There are programs, for instance, if you're using a computer or laptop. One that I use on my laptop is called f.lux or Flux.
Yeah.
And that's a program that automatically will pull the blue out of the screen as it gets darker. A lot of phones and tablets now have, in terms of software, they have a program that will do the same thing.
That's right.
In our house, we actually have just certain lamps in every room, particularly the bedrooms, as we're winding down, that we just have either kind of orangey or yellowish lights in them. So if I'm, reading in bed at night, I can just put that lamp on, not have the overhead light, which is a white light, on, and just help that, as a wind down process. So I'm not being exposed to that bright blue. But all that makes a difference. Yeah.
What's another mechanism that's on the list that's causing cancer?
Okay, so we talked about melatonin suppression. Another one, which was brought to light by Dr. Henry Lai, is what's called the Fenton reaction, which is an iron oxidation. So he proposed that electromagnetic fields cause a derangement in iron, and this oxidation is giving rise to free radical damage. A related mechanism came to us from Dr. Martin Pall that we alluded to last episode, which is electromagnetic fields very clearly cause an increase of tissue calcium through what is known as voltage-gated calcium channels. And so both of these, whether it really is iron or it's calcium, they're both really having the same effect on the body, which is they are increasing free radical damage. And again, that's the smoking gun. Wherever you increase free radical damage, you have the potential for DNA damage, cancer.
And is there also a mechanism related to the blood-brain barrier?
Yes. So how that works is that electromagnetic fields very specifically are having an effect on this protective layer of the brain. Why is that important? It's because that's often where, in the case of cell phones, we're holding them very close to our head. So not only do we have this breakdown of the very protective shield of our brain, of our very sensitive neurology, we also have this suppressive melatonin. We have this effect on calcium and iron. Again, I think all of these mechanisms are at work. So now we have three lines of evidence. We have the epidemiology, We have these experimental studies clearly showing DNA damage. We have very likely mechanisms involved. And now we turn to the last corroborating line of evidence, which is looking at animal studies. So if all of these things are true, then we should be able to predict that we can see increased cancer rates in a laboratory experiment with animals. And that very much is the case. And the most pivotal study in this regard came from our government's own national toxicology program. And here they had, very interestingly, they had two cohorts. They had mice and rats. They studied mice with a frequency of around 1900 megahertz. And what they found is what they called equivocal evidence, which means there was a marginal increase in neoplasms, or again, a fancy way of saying cancer. But then they studied rats, and they exposed rats to 900 megahertz, which is basically the same frequency as an old-fashioned cordless phone. And they exposed these rats up to 2 years, so much longer time frame. And then this is what they found. Of all of these groupings of rats, 5 of them had equivocal evidence, meaning there was a marginal increase in cancer rates. 2 of these groups showed some evidence, and 1 showed no evidence. Now, this was in 2016. Just last year, all of this research was compiled and it was re-examined, and they came back with what their final conclusion was. Now, again, 5 of these, what are called cohorts, were shown to have equivocal evidence, which means there was a marginal increase in cancer. Well, by 2018, once this team of peer review researchers came and looked at the evidence, they upgraded it. They then made the statement that now we say that 5 cohorts are now showing what's called clear evidence of an increase of cancer.
Whoa, so how come in 2016 it was different than this more recent examination of the results?
Well, they looked to dig a little deeper. They analyzed the research, and they had more people looking at it. Again, that's what's called peer review. And so when they took all of that into consideration, the story, it wasn't better. It was worse than what they thought. So now, by their own criteria of what is considered an increase in cancer rate, we have 5 of those 8 cohorts showing increased risk of cancer. And the cancer that they saw, again, were glioma, no surprise, but then also cancer of the adrenal gland and cancer of the heart, oddly enough. So here, now we have animal studies clearly showing this effect as well.
So I want to put a link in the show notes to these studies that you're referencing, because I think it's fascinating and important for people to see the facts. But my question is, if this information isn't getting out there on this podcast, who's putting it out there? Like, why aren't people sounding the alarm bells?
I'm trying, Hilda. I'm trying as hard as I can. And again, I mean, it's not because I think that we need to all, live in caves. We just need to have a more sensible approach to this. And I would encourage people to, again, think a bit more holistically, think a bit more long-term. It's very similar to, like I said, about cigarette smoking. We have to have a bigger, longer-term view of what's going on.
Okay, so I'm thinking long-term and I'm thinking holistically, but 5G is coming to my neighborhood.
Oh, dear, yes.
I'm not even kidding you. So what am I supposed to do about that?
All right, so let's talk about what 5G even means and kind of how it's being implemented. So 5G just means 5th generation. Okay, for quite a while now, we've been influenced by the 4th generation of rollout from the telecommunications companies. So just to give you an idea of just the science, the frequencies, for the 4th generation, or 4G, is in a frequency range of anywhere from 700 megahertz to about 6 gigahertz. Again, just as a point of comparison, if you have a Bluetooth device that you're using, that's around 2.45 gigahertz. Now, 5G is 6 gigahertz to up to 90 gigahertz, and in some cases even as high as 300 gigahertz. So we're talking about a much higher frequency.
Is that the frequency coming from the cell towers?
Yeah, so 5G is getting rolled out in 2 ways. The way that's going to be most common, what's probably going to appear in your neighborhood if you're in any bit of an urban area, is what's called a phased array, which means much smaller cell phone towers are being placed about every 100 meters. There's pros and cons to this. The pro is that those towers themselves are much lower power. They're lower wattage than, say, the great big cell phone tower that's standing, at the edge of town, for instance. However, the con side now is you're completely surrounded by them. and they're of this much higher frequency. They're all around you. You really can't escape it. So that's the main way it's being implemented, but there is a second proposal, which is to beam 5G frequencies down from space from satellites. And this is a whole nother can of worms. The 5G itself has been quite controversial, to say the least. If you go online, there's what's called the 5G appeal, which is essentially a European Union initiative that has a few hundred signatures from very prominent scientists in the field who are opposing it. Now, the whole 5G space thing is another major issue. And there's an appeal, similarly, for people who are deeply concerned about the 5G that's coming down from space.
Coming up, Brandon talks about the 5G cellular technology and ways to shield or help mitigate the damage.
You're listening to the Wise Traditions podcast from the Weston A. Price Foundation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors.
Grass-fed kidney by Ancestral Supplements. Ancestral Supplements offer New Zealand-sourced, nose-to-tail organ meats, bone marrow, and kidney in simple, convenient gelatin capsules. There's an old Comanche narrative that has been retold for generations about a young man who loved his wife so much that when she died, he fed her the fresh kidney of a buffalo, and then she came back to life. This tale has remained with the Comanche people to serve a greater purpose, to pass on the wisdom of feeding kidney to those who are ailing. There are many accounts of our ancestors taking an animal. The young and the warriors, for example, favored liver and heart, while the ailing, frail, and the old received kidney to build strength, immunity, and vitality. Kidney provided concentrated amounts of kidney-specific proteins, B12, selenium, and DAO that are now absent from the modern diet. This nourishment is known to support kidney, urinary, thyroid, and histamine health. So visit ancestralsupplements.com to see what they can do for you. Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. And this month marks the 20th anniversary of the Weston A. Price Foundation. Help us celebrate 20 years of accurate information on diet and health by supporting local farms. Take the 50-50 pledge. Spend at least 50% of your food dollar purchasing milk, raw milk, of course, raw milk products, eggs, poultry, meat, and produce, for example, directly from local farmers and artisans. With the other 50% of your food dollar, you can celebrate how small the world has become and enjoy things like rice, pineapple, and spices from other parts of the world. So tag us at Weston A. Price on your social media posts related to the pledge, or use the hashtag 5050pledge to let us know that you're in on it with us. We're so grateful. Thanks in advance. Here's to another 20 years of living our best lives thanks to nutrient-dense food. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Yes, because I've heard that Elon Musk just launched all these satellites, and I know Mark Zuckerberg, the head of Facebook, wants to see the whole world blanketed in 5G. And so there's this push coming from people in this technology space. I'm glad to hear there's some voices of reason and concern being raised as well.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's going to be much harder to escape. I mean, even if you're out in the country like I am, I'm in rural Wisconsin. If you've got 5G being beamed down on you, I mean, you don't really have too many other options. Perhaps a metal roof would protect you to some degree, but even then, you couldn't even go out in your yard without being exposed to it.
Wow. So that being the case, we're back to kind of mitigating and avoiding and shielding.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, to talk a little bit about that, I think, one of the first things you can do, it's a reasonable thing to do, is to really see for yourself. Don't take my word for it. Measure these fields in and around your environment to see if there are problems, see what you're being exposed to. And, we talked about these three different kinds of electromagnetic fields. One of them being just the current going through your house, another one being transient voltage or dirty electricity, and the third being microwave or radio frequency radiation. And each of these requires a different kind of meter to see what you're being exposed to. So if you just wanted to walk around your house and see, for instance, what that lamp over there, or let's say you have an electric stove, how much radiation these utilities are giving off, basically what you need for that is what's called a Gauss meter for electromagnetic fields, and an electric field meter for electric fields. And both of those can get paired into one device, which is called the tri-field meter. So if you buy a tri-field meter, and we give very specific recommendations in the afterword of our book of what kind of meters we recommend, you walk around your house with a tri-field meter, you can kind of see where it spikes, where there's areas that have an increased electromagnetic field. And that could be from, again, just from the things you have plugged into your walls, but it can also be due to wiring defects. Let's say there's a problem in the wiring behind the wall. That itself can give rise to an electromagnetic field that's encroaching into your living space, so to speak. Now, the second one, which we talked about, which is transient voltage, these are spikes that are occurring, noise, as it were, that are occurring on top of the wiring within our homes and offices. So they are considered higher frequency harmonics in the kilohertz and the low megahertz range. And so to measure these, or I should say a proxy to measure these fields, you would need what's called an EMI meter, or electromagnetic interference meter. And this is simply a meter that has a plug-in that you would go to any outlet in your house, plug it in, and it would give you a number and show you how much of this electrical noise is piggybacking off of the clean energy that's coming into your house. And this would be true of any circuit or any outlet along that same circuit. So if you measure a high number at one outlet, any other outlet on that same circuit should have that same number. So it's very clear you can see how each of these circuits in your house or your office are having these high amount of voltage transient fields.
And this is important so people can just evaluate their situation. Again, we're not trying to frighten people or, as you said, suggest that they go move to a cave, but you need to know what you're facing, right? And
Absolutely.
then you can know best how to move forward.
Yeah, and there are specialists. There are EMF inspectors that you can hire that can come onto your property, and they can look for all of these things. The problem is there's not very many of them around. And if there isn't one in your area, you could choose to buy some of these meters and kind of make these discoveries on your own. The last one that I'll mention is just microwave radiation, which again, this is what's coming from cell phones and smart meters. And so you can buy a microwave meter and walk around your house and see, for instance, well, that digital meter on the outside of my house, it encroaches this far into our living space. You can hold up your cell phone and turn on that radio frequency meter and see how far that field comes out from your cell phone. You can see how far your wireless router comes out into your living space there again.
And I would venture to guess that there are other people in people's community, I know there are in mine, who are like-minded and considering the impact of these non-native EMFs on our health. So don't feel like you have to go it alone. And we'll also put a link in our show notes for resources for these meters and for geobiologists, people who come about and can help measure your home. So again, you know what you're facing. And have you done some of this for your own home?
Yeah, I have. I say one of the biggest decisions we made is recently we bought a house is to wire it, and we have Ethernet cables going all throughout the house. And so we can plug in our devices, our computers, even our tablets. And so we don't have to rely on Wi-Fi at all.
So it's great for us to consider how much we use our cell phone, whether we use a microwave in our home, how much we're wired or wireless.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms of the 5G, I know that there are groups that are trying to give a response, a reasoned voice to those who want to move forward with the rollout. So we'll encourage people to do that. But what about, let's say, it starts coming down from from space.
Yeah.
Are you going to get a metal roof? Talk to me, Brandon.
I might. I don't know. Yeah. So, there's other solutions. I talked to one expert in the field about this, and he said even if you had traditional, roof tiles, there's ways you can put a layer underneath that would block electromagnetic fields. So, it really just depends, Hilda, on where you live. How close are you to cell phone towers? If you are in an urban area, it's difficult. You even if you choose not to have a Wi-Fi router yourself, you could still have dozens and dozens of other signals around. Even where I am in my office, I can pick up maybe a dozen different signals. So, we try the best we can. That was why we had that little talk about resilience. You take care of yourself, take care of your body. You do the best you can in your home environment. And probably the most important is your sleeping environment. You can make some choices that will keep your resting body as minimally exposed to electromagnetic fields as possible.
Absolutely. So, well, that's a great word. And I can't believe our time has almost elapsed here as well. So let me ask you this, Brandon, as we wrap up. If the listener could do one thing in general to improve their health or protect themselves, what would you recommend that they do?
Obviously, as a clinician, I think about this all the time. And if I had to give you one answer to that question, I would just say forgive yourself. And the reason why is because, most of the patients that walk through my door, they have, they're suffering from diseases of lifestyle. And those diseases are coming because of, poor choices. I mean, even just this morning, I had a patient come in. She was telling me about her dietary indiscretions of the weekend. And so I just looked at her and I said, forgive yourself, try better tomorrow. I think coming from a place of forgiveness, we can really empower ourselves to make better choices, move on, grow stronger.
That's one of the principles that the foundation holds on to, actually, because you need to forgive yourself. And then you are actually more able to forgive others. It's a beautiful thing. And it's on a kind of healing arts part of the spectrum.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, Brandon. It's been a pleasure. Our guest today was Brandon LaGreca. Find out more about his work at easttroyacupuncture.com. And you can find me on my Holistic Hilda YouTube channel, just launched this summer. And the show notes for this and every episode of the Wise Traditions podcast are on the westonaprice.org website. Just go to the podcast page to find them. And that's it. Thanks for listening, everybody, and see you next time.
Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.